When the two detectives had left the diner, it was several hours before dawn. Carrington had Guthridge drive him back to the precinct. Carrington found where he had parked his car and got into it, but his mind was still swirling with all the loose ends and oddities of the Jack Turner case. Carrington knew he would be unable to sleep if he went home to his empty house. Instead, he drove his car out to one of the several checkpoints on the edge of town, where vehicles were being stopped and inspected for any sign of Jack Turner. Carrington showed his badge and offered a hand to the patrol officers on the scene, but they told him they had everything covered, so he remained in his car. Carrington stared out over the rainy panorama of the traffic stop, the back and forth of the patrol officers in rain gear, the slow deceleration and acceleration of headlights. He let the red and blue lights of the parked squad cars wash over him, and he fell asleep. Carrington was hit with the sweet smell that only a thick carpet of dead leaves rotting in the middle of a forest can make. It was mixed with the odor of damp earth, moss-covered stones, and the sweet perfume of wildflowers. He opened one eye, then both. Carrington was seated in a clearing somewhere in the middle of an unfamiliar and very old forest. Through the undergrowth all around him, Carrington could see weathered tombstones leaning and lurching up at various angles, only their top halves visible above the brush and fallen leaves. Carrington could tell the tombstones were quite ancient. The lettering was worn off of most of them. Late afternoon sunlight struggled to pierce the thick canopy of the twisted oaks and tall, imposing pine trees that surrounded the clearing. What little light made it threw a dappled pattern of shadows on the brush and the ancient grave markers. Carrington was sitting in a plastic chair. His feet were propped up on a funerary statue that looked like one of those winding, worm-like dragons from ancient Chinese folklore. Carrington was on the side facing the gaping maw of the stone dragon. He did not like the look of that, even though he knew it was inert. A black spider slowly appeared from behind the top edge of the dragon's sinewy back. Carrington quickly took his feet off of the statue and stood up. As he did so, his shoes crunched in the carpet of fallen leaves and pine needles. Beneath, he could hear the quiet rustling of unseen creatures. The atmosphere was one of eerie tranquility. The only sounds in the place were the calls of unseen birds, the chirp of crickets, and the occasional creaking of branches overhead. Light filtering through the dense foliage created shafts of ethereal beams that fell on and illuminated some of the graves. Next to the edge of the clearing, farthest from Carrington, stood Caroline Marsh. She was dressed in what looked like an old-time baptismal gown, but it was soaked and splattered with mud. Carrington called over to her. "We just have a few questions, Miss Marsh." Marsh slowly raised a hand to shoulder height, then pointed straight down with an elongated index finger that was tipped with a pointed and blackened fingernail. Carrington looked down at the ground at his feet. There was a fairy ring of mushrooms, about 3 feet in diameter, on the ground in front of him. Then the mushrooms twisted and morphed before his eyes. In a flicker they had all turned into long, gray teeth sticking up out of the ground. "We just need the body," Carrington shouted over to Marsh. He got down on his knees and started using his hands to dig away at the earth inside the ring of teeth. Carrington came out of sleep in a sweat. The sun was up. His throat was burning. A police officer was knocking on his driver door window. Carrington rolled it down and showed the young officer his badge. Carrington explained about coming out the night before to aid with the checkpoint, and that the officers on duty at the time had not needed him. "Checkpoints are all getting called off this morning, Detective," the officer informed him. "No sign of the suspect?" Carrington asked. "No, sir, not as far as we've been told," the officer replied. The officer walked away. Carrington sat for a few minutes, struggling to recall the dream he had just had. He knew it had been some kind of nightmare. He remembered trees and the smell of damp earth. He could recall the image of Marsh with her dress soaked in mud, or had it been blood? But it was all fading away too fast, the way dreams often do. Carrington headed home, showered and changed, then drove to the precinct. Guthridge was already there. She and Carrington met up by the coffee pot. "I'd say you look like you got no sleep, but you always look like that," Guthridge said. She handed Carrington a cup of coffee, which he accepted. "Did anybody nab Turner while I was gone?" asked Carrington. "No Jack Turner yet," Guthridge replied. "Any bodies show up at the morgue with a silver bullet inside of them?" Carrington asked. "None so far," Guthridge told him. "We're still hovering around square one." She sipped her coffee. "Less than square one," she muttered. Then Guthridge added, "We can hang around here and wait for Internal Affairs to call us in for an inquisition, or we can get back out there and chase down some answers. The forensics lab just finished processing the burned-up car from the clearing where Marsh said Turner shot somebody. I'm headed to the lab in a minute to see what the technicians can tell me." "Square one," Carrington ruminated, then said, "Not a bad idea, Detective. You hit the lab. I'm going to go back to square one, see what we missed." Less than an hour later, Carrington was rolling his sedan down the rutted dirt path that led to the clearing in the woods. Forensics had long since finished processing the scene and had towed the 2 car remains back to the lab. All that was left was burn marks, tire tracks, and police tape strung from trees. Carrington parked outside the loose rectangle of police tape. He got out, ducked under the tape, and took a slow walk around. He paused, peered up at the canopy overhead, then pointed his nose back down at the mud and leaves. Carrington could make out where the cars had been parked. He could tell where the vehicle fire had been. There was charred earth and 4 blobs of melted rubber left in the dirt. A huge blackened grease mark was left from where the engine block had burned. Where the other car had hit a tree, there was still a pool of oil and engine coolant soaking into the earth. Standing at the edge of the clearing, Carrington played out in his mind the fantastical events Marsh had conjured up back in her hospital room. He cycled through a handful of what he thought were more likely scenarios in his head, but it was a struggle to match each one with what he was seeing in the clearing. There were no obvious deviations from what Marsh had told the 2 detectives and what Carrington was seeing there in the woods. He could tell there had definitely been a 3rd car at the scene. Forensics had verified it. It was almost certainly an older Cadillac. It had rolled up to meet 2 cars that were already parked in the woods. What, Carrington wondered, had actually happened here? There was movement about 30 feet into the trees on the other side of the clearing from where Carrington stood. He straightened up and squinted through the branches and vines, trying to make out if it was just a deer or if it was a person prowling around his crime scene. There, he saw it more clearly this time. Black leather jacket, long hair, some kind of brown tunic. "Halt!" Carrington yelled. "Police!" Then Carrington was badge out, gun out, and charging through the trees, yelling at the person to stop. Back at the forensics lab, Guthridge was going over the burned car with a lab technician who was the department's specialist in accident reconstructions. "Where'd the fire start?" Guthridge was asking. "V patterns and debris analysis tell us this fire started bright and hot in the driver's side rear seat," the technician responded. "It started in the back seat, not on the outside of the car?" Guthridge asked. "Indeed it did," the technician confirmed. "This was the job of some sort of heavy-duty accelerant." Guthridge continued, "So whoever did this poured the gasoline into the back seat instead of just pouring it all over the car?" "Well, we haven't been able to determine what kind of accelerant they used, not just yet," the technician replied. "But my court statement will say that whatever they used, It wasn't gasoline. No trace of what the accelerant was. Could it have been cleaned up and removed before the evidence team got there? Guthridge asked. To clean up that thoroughly, the person or the people that did this would have had way more time than they did, responded the technician. No, either we'll find something eventually, or the accelerant caused a fire that was so hot and so rapid that the fire burned up all the accelerant. That, or it was a totally novel accelerant that we've not even heard about before. The last option is pretty far-fetched in the extreme. I'm pretty certain it's going to turn out to be the first scenario, Detective. Here's something else will interest you, the technician continued. Both the cars we recovered from the scene were the same car. How does that work? Guthridge asked. The VIN plates were copied, the technician replied. The cars are the exact same make, model, color, and specs. I mean, the one with slightly more mileage might have possibly been the original. So, we got a cult that kidnaps people and also indulges in some kind of insurance fraud, Guthridge said. Could be a way to fund their activities. Then her phone rang. It was Carrington. He had just taken someone into custody. Guthridge excused herself and drove back to the precinct. Guthridge walked the long hallway of offices and interview rooms until she got to the last one. She knocked, then opened the door and stepped inside. Carrington was sitting across the interview room's table from a young man who was dressed in an oversized leather jacket. Guthridge noticed that under the jacket the young man wore a rough woolen tunic. It was like the kind of thing she expected to see on a monk. There was a host of medallions, amulets, and charms hanging from multiple chains, resting on the young man's chest below his scraggly beard. Guthridge noticed a faded tattoo on his left cheekbone. It was a tiny pentagram. Guthridge had walked in while they were talking. "What is it I'm being charged with?" the young man was asking Carrington. "I don't know yet," Carrington replied. "For starters, you fled a police interview when I identified myself back in those woods. You knowingly endangered an officer of the law. You made me have to run through the woods to catch you. I could have tripped." The young man looked up at Carrington and uttered the words, "Tell us that which you remember, which you know but we do not, nor have we heard." "Are you seriously quoting scripture at me right now?" Carrington barked. "How about you start by just telling me your name? Or do we arrest you for wandering around city property with no ID on you?" "My name is Petey Ghee," the man told Carrington. "But those who love me call me Petey." "Okay, Petey. Tell us what you were doing in the woods today," Guthridge suggested, "and you can skip quoting scripture for now." "I'm hunting the same quarry as you, Detective Carrington, and—" Petey Ghee said, and looked up at Guthridge. She was about to tell him her name, but then Ghee addressed her directly. "Detective Guthridge, is that right?" "I guess we must have already met," Guthridge replied, though she did not remember ever arresting this person in the past. She would have remembered the pentagram. "Like you, I have been given a mandate and hold authority from higher powers," Ghee declared to both the detectives. "Higher powers?" Guthridge asked, one eyebrow raised. "You mean like the group responsible for kidnapping Caroline Marsh?" "Where is Caroline?" Ghee asked, sitting up a little bit. "Why do you want to know so bad?" Guthridge asked. "There was a shooting in that forest clearing 2 nights ago," Carrington interjected. "Who got shot? No games, Petey. We need to know. Somebody's family needs to know." "Oh, this is no game," Petey Ghee agreed, smiling broadly and leaning back in his chair. His leather jacket creaked as he did so. The laugh lines stood out at the corners of his eyes as he looked up at the overhead light and breathed out an almost hysterical laugh. "Your investigation is touching upon forces and entities way, way outside your knowledge," Ghee pronounced, his eyes widening. "Forces and entities way beyond how you frame the world, Or the tiny little lenses you put over your eyes so you only see what makes sense to your limited cognition. The purpose of your existence? Ghee stopped mid-sentence. He held out his hands a few inches above the table, like two parentheses he wanted to frame an idea with that was refusing to form into words. Well, he continued, lowering his hands, they are certainly nothing to toy with. Who got shot in those woods? Guthridge asked as monosyllabically as possible. Petey held up both hands in a gesture of placation. He bowed his head slightly. No living being was killed. Ghee breathed into the room with all the sincerity he could muster. Were you involved in the abduction and unlawful retention of Caroline Marsh? Carrington asked. Petey Ghee replied that he had no idea about anything like that. Then he asked again, where is Caroline right now? Where's your group based out of? Guthridge asked. Your cult, they around here in town somewhere? My cult? Ghee asked, sounding genuinely perplexed. He raised his hands and looked all around the room. Oh, them, he said. Well, everywhere and nowhere, detectives. Everywhere and nowhere. Okay, let's get a little more specific, Carrington said. I'd really like to speak to the fellow who was driving the Cadillac that morning. Ah, said Ghee, smiling cryptically. You're referring to the adduced one named Dennis Peltry. Carrington leaned forward. You're damn right I am, Carrington snapped. Where is he? How do I find him? Ghee leaned forward as well, keeping up that cryptic little smirk. Dennis Peltry, he replied, was out of time. Then he fell back in. And that happened probably not too long after his master ceased to be in this world. What exactly are you talking about? Guthridge demanded. You need to stop playing games and start answering us in plain English. Ghee asked again if he was under arrest. No, replied Carrington. But we need to know how to get back in touch with you. Where are you staying? Ghee smiled, raised his hands again, and uttered the words, A snake has its hole, and the viper its nest. Wolves rest from the hunt in their burrows. But the chattel has no place to find peace or find rest, not while it breathes and its crimson still flows. Are you aware of the location of Jack Turner? Guthridge asked. This made Ghee sit bolt upright. Jack Turner? Where is Jack Turner? Are you two aware of the location of Jack Turner? Ghee demanded. Why don't you tell us? Carrington said. So, you do not have any idea where he is, do you? Ghee replied bemusedly. That's what all the roadblocks were for yesterday. Are you hunting Jack Turner as well? Carrington and Guthridge said nothing. Petey Ghee's eyes blazed with gleeful contempt. Of course you don't know where he is. Turner slipped right past you, didn't he? Right through your fingers like oil. And I bet he did it so easily. Oh, no worries, Mr. Ghee, Carrington retorted. We're sure to turn up your friend Jack Turner. And when we do, we're going to find out if you've been deliberately obstructing a police investigation. Ghee pointed at Carrington's face. All you are to someone like Jack Turner is an afterthought. All of you chattel. An afterthought, Ghee hissed. You just don't go find someone like Jack Turner. You think he's some stray cat you can just set out a snare for and wait? You have to augur. You have to cozen. You have to beguile. It is obvious from what has just come forth from your lips you do not possess the arcana to do so. Guthridge stifled a genuine laugh. Carrington opened his mouth to respond, but Ghee held up a finger, shut his eyes, and turned his face contemplatively to the electric lights overhead. If those who lead you by the nose say to you, 'See, the kingdom is in the shadows,' then the bats and vultures will precede you," Petey Ghee intoned. Carrington and Guthridge said nothing, just looked at each other in disbelief. Ghee went on. "If they say to you, 'It is in the sea,' then the dragons of the deep will precede you. Therefore the kingdom is not inside of you. It blazes in the dark hearts of the princes of this world." "All right, that's enough, Mr. Ghee," Guthridge cut him off. "Jack Turner's got a warrant out against him as of yesterday. If you know anything, you need to tell us right now. If you don't, then you are aiding and abetting a known fugitive." "Obviously, I'm wasting my time coming here," Ghee mewled and stood up from his chair. "We didn't say you could leave," Carrington said. Ghee made no response at all. He simply walked to the door of the interview room, opened it, and stepped out. Carrington leaned back in his chair. It was just him and Guthridge in the interview room now. "What a bizarre SOB," Carrington said. "Should we get him back in here and let him prattle on some more? He might spill the beans eventually." "Let him go," Guthridge sighed. "That guy's just going to quote a bunch more scripture at us, then call for his attorney." "Oh, that was scripture?" Carrington asked. "I don't know," replied Guthridge. "Ain't any kind of scripture I ever heard coming from any pulpit." The first sight Garda caught of Dale Harness's farm were two decrepit silos peeking up over the tree line. Both were in obvious disuse. One was missing its roof. The metal gate across the entrance to the farm was closed and locked. On either side of the gravel drive were low, wet areas, each about the size of a soccer field and overgrown with tall, thin cut grass. Garda pulled the tires of the car onto the small spit of weed-choked gravel between the road and the gate. She got out and walked over to the gate. She stood on her side, observing. To her left, past a stand of cypress, were row after row of oversized white plastic tubes left lying side by side on the ground. At first, Garda thought maybe these were hay bales. Then she realized the plastic tubes were filled with cattle feed that spilled out at the ends and already looked partially rotted. Off to her right were several buildings, sheds, a barn, more sheds, and what was probably a house. The breeze blew toward her from the direction of the farm. It smelled like manure. Garda remained where she was, head and shoulder well high above the top of the metal gate. She waited. It took about 8 minutes, but she heard the sound of an ATV approaching her from the house. At first, there was just the silhouette of the rider and the dust kicked out behind him by the ATV's tires. As he got closer, Garda saw that it was an elderly gentleman approaching her, bareheaded, in green overalls and large black rubber boots. He pulled up to his side of the gate. "Help you?" he inquired loudly over the sound of the running motor. "Are you Dale Harness?" Garda asked. She did not yell. Rather, she projected, clearly and from her diaphragm, in a voice that could be made out through the din. No answer. The motor kept up its rapid popping and spewing. "I'm not the police," she said. "I'm looking for Jack Turner." No response. "I'm his half-sister." The elderly farmer cut off the motor and carefully dismounted from his vehicle. He walked up to the gate and squinted at Garda. He was a tall man, but still had to peer up at a slight angle in order to make eye contact with her. "Well, you sure are," he said. "I'll be damned, you look like him." He took out a rag and wiped his brow, then wiped the corner of his mouth. Garda saw that there was a mixture of saliva and loose brown tobacco flakes coating his bottom teeth that he kept sifting around with his tongue as he spoke. Well, Jack hasn't been around here for a while, Harness said to her. Then he asked, You say he's your half-brother? Yeah, we have the same dad, Garda said. Harness shook his head. Sorry, miss, he never mentioned you, Harness said. Never mentioned anybody, actually. Sorry, how'd you find this place? I have my ways, Garda said. Don't worry, I'm pretty sure the police never knew he was here. But he's family to me and I'm looking for him, that's all. I see, Harness said. Well, he's not here. I haven't seen Jack Turner in, well, maybe a couple of months. He was gone for a couple of months before that, too. But then he showed up here again one night completely out of the blue. Slept the night in his spot in the barn. Then he had me drive him to the bank in the morning to collect the last of his wages. Then he was gone again. I drove back from town without him. Where was he headed? Never said. Why'd he stop working for you? Never said. Any idea what he was up to? Harness let out a chagrined chuckle. So, miss, you don't really know him, do you? The old man asked. To be honest, sir, Garda replied, I only found out he existed last week. I'm in the Army, and I'm getting redeployed in a couple of weeks. I just like to make some kind of contact with him before I do. Harness stepped forward, leaned his forearms across the top of the gate, and looked back up at Garda. Look, Miss Garda. Garda, Harness said. Your brother, your half-brother, Jack, he is feral. Feral, what do you mean? Asked Garda. Look, I don't know what happened to him. I don't know what kind of childhood he had. But it must have been something really bad. I mean, he's certainly not dumb or anything like that. Your brother was one of the most keenly intelligent people I ever met. He can do anything. You know, he fixed a broken-down tractor that was stuck way out in the middle of one of my fields without ever having barely driven one before. He's not even driven a car before. But he just sat and stared at the engine parts for long enough and then tinkered until he got it running again. Got the tractor's engine running and then figured out how to drive it out of the field for me in less than a couple of hours. Saved me a lot of money that day. And he's strong as an ox, too. He was always a great worker. But, well, he's different in other ways, too, from other people. Different? Garda repeated. How so? Don't get me wrong, he can read and do things like that, Harness said. He learned to speak Spanish from the other workers while he was here, just by talking to them. But he doesn't really partake in society the way you and I do, you know what I mean? Please enlighten me, Garda replied. Never had a cell phone, Harness answered. Not just that, never watched TV. Hardly ever sat at table with me. And when he did, he hardly spoke a word. Had me drive him places like a couple of times, but he would never learn to drive a car himself. Walks everywhere, hitches rides, as far as I can tell. Your brother's got no bank account or mailing address or anything like that. He owns nothing but whatever clothing he's wearing at the time. Literally, I think he only ever owned one set of clothes at a time the whole time he worked for me. Your brother had no friends, as far as I can tell, no relatives. He never went to school. He hunted when work was slow, and he slept in the woods most of the times, or in a spot in the barn. Never slept in a house. Like I said, feral. What did he do here? Garda asked. Worked, Harness replied. When it's off-season and I don't need a bunch of guys around here, he was the only worker I needed. During planting and harvesting, he did the work of 5 grown men. Cut down on the total number I had to hire. I'm going to literally have to hire 4 or 5 additional guys to replace him here pretty soon when the season begins again. Garda asked to see where Turner had slept in the barn. Harness pulled the gate aside and let her drive the rental car onto his property. Then he got back on his ATV and led her to one of the barns at the back of the property. The inside of the barn was strewn with piles of farming equipment and old furniture. Harness showed Garda a space in one of the back corners, where 2 old office desks had been set together and topped with several musty blankets. The only redeeming feature Garda could make out, about where her brother had slept, was the building's only window. It was a small square of glass. It had a coating of grime. There was a host of dead insects strewn all over its inner sill. There was no apparent way to open it. Garda stooped down a bit to see out. The window faced the back of the property. There was a freshly tilled field right outside of it. Beyond that was the edge of a woodland. "Your brother took down the crazy wall he had up," Harness called from the doorway. "His what?" Garda asked. Still coming no closer than the doorway, Harness gestured at the wall next to where Garda was standing. Garda noticed that next to the window there were several pushpins stuck into the drywall. Some of the pushpins still had bits of string hanging from them. There were remnants of tape, and the corners left of papers that had recently been torn away. But from even what little was left, to Garda's eyes the arrangement suggested a definite pattern. Documents of some type, be they news clippings or photos or data printed on office paper. It had all been hung from the wall, and then it had all been connected by strings. "It was like something out of a police TV show," Garda heard Harness say behind her. "One of your brother's oddities. I never asked him about it." Garda pried loose with her fingernail one of the pieces of tape. Stuck to its underside was a tiny triangle of newsprint. It was the edge of some kind of map. All Garda could make out on it was the serpentine curve of some kind of inland waterway. Something had been written in pencil on the wall in tiny, neat letters. Garda got her nose up closer to it. Le Moyne, 1720. Ordinateur. "Where'd everything go?" Garda asked. "I guess he took it all down and took it with him," Harness said with a shrug. The two walked out to Garda's car. "And he never said where he was going?" Garda asked. "He never talked about what he was up to when he wasn't here?" "I tried asking him once or twice," Harness replied. "But it was like talking to a brick wall. Sorry, miss." "But tell him," Harness added, "if you can find him. He's always welcome back here. Same arrangement we always had." Caroline Marsh lay in her hospital room, barely able to breathe. Fear and dread kept hitting her in merciless waves. Sometimes her panicked breathing would abate, but then minutes later her tortured mind would fall into a sea of dark visions, where the entire world was a hellish void, hemmed in by relentless slabs of concrete. Every empty corner in the modern world's liminal landscape became a prison filled with distracted cattle, whose real purpose in this world was nothing more than to eat, breed, and wait for the abattoir. Marsh forced herself to open her eyes. She forced her gaze down over the sheets that covered her legs and feet. She could see past the end of her bed to the window in her dark hospital room. The curtains were wide open. A strange celestial orb hung in the starless sky. Neither the sun nor the moon. It was blood-red and menacing. The hospital all around Marsh had gone almost completely silent. There were no sounds of traffic from outside. The only things Marsh could still hear were the tick of an office clock somewhere out in the hallway and the pulse of her own blood through the vessels in her ears. Everyone was gone. Marsh was completely alone. Beginning at the soles of her feet and moving relentlessly up her ankles, Marsh could feel the crawling and skitter of 1,000 tiny spiders on her skin. Slowly the top of a large, pale and hairless head emerged from just outside the bottom of her window. Its waxen, bare scalp reflected the pallor of the crimson orb. The feeling of legions of spiders had reached Marsh's chest. The giant head continued to rise, and 2 eyes peered at her over the bottom of the window frame. Those eyes were deep-set into bruised, wrinkled flesh, blazing with hatred, bottomless woe, and demonic desire. The irises glowed with a deathly yellow hue that flickered like flame. Marsh was overwhelmed by the sensation of the spiders crawling all over her skin, eyes, mouth, and scalp. Marsh woke up screaming. The full light of day poured in from her open window. Marsh continued to scream for almost a full minute before the nurse came in. "Another bad one, honey?" the nurse asked Marsh. "We got Dr. Ringle on call if you want to talk to somebody." "No," said Marsh. Reality was flooding back, but it was not much better than the dream she just had. At least the feeling of spiders all over her skin was mostly gone for now. Mostly. It never quite left. "Can I get up?" Marsh asked, her throat dry and raw. "I just want to walk around a little bit." Some strength was coming back to her legs and her back, and the hospital staff had been able to remove her IV. Marsh took to a habit of pacing part of the hallway where her room was. The hospital staff would let her go out into the hall as far as the double doors at the end before turning back. The walking helped, if only to help Marsh regain some desperately needed sense of agency. Marsh knew the doors throughout the hospital had locks. She knew there was a police officer on guard outside her room most of the night. She knew that she was surrounded in this place by the living and the naive. But she could not escape the conviction that this stay in the hospital was just a temporary respite, something that was being granted, something that would be soon snatched away. No matter how safe her surroundings felt, Marsh was still in the clutches of her captors, and she knew it. The whole world was their kill pen, and unless that changed, it was just a matter of time for Marsh. She was nothing but chattel. Her life was something that was allowed only as long as it was convenient for the dark princes roaming this world. On one of her return trips to the hospital room, Marsh's fears were confirmed. On the sill right outside her window perched a vulture. It was peering directly at her through the glass. Its feathers were jet black, and the skin on its neck and head were completely bare and as white as dry bone. Its eyes smoldered with antipathy and scorn. Marsh shrieked at the top of her lungs when she saw the thing. This summoned the nurse again. The nurse saw the vulture and also screamed. Then the nurse marshaled herself and rushed toward the window, waving her arms to shoo the beast away. At first, the vulture completely ignored the nurse, continuing to lock eyes with Marsh. Then, slowly it turned from the window, kicked off the ledge, and took to the air. Marsh watched the lazy flap of its wings as it soared out over the parking lot, arced around over some treetops, caught an updraft, and glided out of sight. Somewhere beyond the walls of the hospital, the hunt for Caroline Marsh had begun. As long as she lived, Marsh knew that no moonrise would ever be safe for her again. Jack Turner woke up in a stand of conifers that sat along the edge of the county landfill. Earlier in the day, he had crawled under a grand old pine tree. He was tired out from hours of walking and needed to rest. The large tree had, over many years, deposited a thick, fragrant blanket of dry, copper-tan needles. Turner had laid on his back and drifted off to sleep to the sound of seagulls scavenging among the sections of the landfill that were still left open to the air. When he awoke a few hours later, Turner watched where the seagulls were landing and taking off. He got up and headed to where he could see them. Seagulls meant exposed trash and no people. It took an hour of digging through heaps of rotting refuse before Turner could find what he was looking for. It had taken longer than he'd expected, but finally Turner came across a piece of stiff wire. It was in the form of an old paperclip. Turner found a secluded spot in a low area, out of sight. There were tire tracks nearby, but they looked old. Nobody had frequented that part of the dump for a while, so Turner made himself comfortable. Turner took a few minutes to just sit and look at the twin locking mechanisms that held the cuffs around either wrist. Turner had picked his way out of handcuffs before. In the past, it had turned out to be a 3-step process. Easy enough once practiced a few times. But these cuffs were a new design, one Turner hadn't seen before. It was some new product line, probably marketed to police departments by its manufacturer, something that was supposed to be more resistant to escape attempts. Turner pondered what he was seeing. He thought about the people who had made these cuffs as much as he thought about the mechanisms themselves. He thought about how his entire world was made up not just of cars and phones and other gizmos. It was made up of people and their greed and their flaws. The makers of these handcuffs, Turner reasoned, were not motivated to create something truly original. There was no money to be made doing anything like that. Therefore, whoever designed these new handcuffs wouldn't have done away with the old existing design. They wouldn't have innovated something completely new in its place. People just don't do that anymore. The existing solution would simply have been given a marketable addendum, something added on top of the old design, made just barely workable enough to be sold to paying customers. Turner reasoned that picking these new locks would probably be a 4-step process, maybe 5, but no more than that. Small, finite numbers. It was nothing Turner could not sit quietly for a while and suss out. Turner's looming presence did not perturb the seagulls as he began probing at the lock with the paperclip. Several of the birds clustered quite close to his serene and quiet form while they pecked about for their sustenance and he fidgeted with the lock. Suddenly and all at once the seagulls near Turner lifted off and flew away. There was the sound of a vehicle rolling down the path through the heaps of trash. A pickup truck appeared around a high, lithifying stack of garbage. Its wheels splashed through the oily puddles in the existing ruts, obliterating their rainbow surfaces. The brakes of the pickup truck gave out a long, duressed sound as its driver did a U-turn and parked the pickup about 30 paces from where Turner sat. More birds lifted off in a perturbed cloud of flapping wings and orange feet. Turner held absolutely still and quiet, moving only his eyes. 2 men climbed out of the pickup truck. They were talking. They leaned up against the front of the hood. One of them lit a cigarette. Turner continued to hold perfectly still and just observe. 5 minutes passed. The smoker was on his second cigarette. The 2 men kept up the chatter. There came the sound of another engine. A delivery truck appeared from the opposite direction that the pickup truck had arrived. There was just one person in this vehicle. That man parked the delivery truck and hopped out. He was visibly nervous. He looked all around him. He looked right at Turner, but completely failed to notice Turner was even there. One of the men from the pickup truck was telling the truck driver that he was being dumb and that he should have backed the delivery truck up to the pickup truck. There was an exasperated but brief exchange, and the driver jumped back into the delivery truck, fired up the engine again, and did a 3-point turn, bringing the rear of the delivery truck up to the tailgate of the other vehicle. The 2 men did not wait for the driver. They opened the back of the delivery truck and started grabbing boxes out of the back. The delivery truck driver came around to see what they were doing. The 2 men emptying the delivery truck would grab a box, take a quick glance at the label, then either set the box carefully into the back of the pickup or toss the box aside unopened into the trash-infused dirt on either side of the vehicles. Only 1 out of every dozen or so boxes ended up stacked in the back of the pickup. Gradually, two haphazard piles of unopened boxes formed next to the pair of trucks. Once the delivery truck was emptied of all its goods, the two men got back into the pickup. The driver climbed back into his cab, not even bothering to close the rear cargo door. Both vehicles were put into gear and drove away. Turner returned to working on undoing the cuffs. 5 minutes later, the seagulls started coming back. Eventually, both of the broken cuffs lay at Turner's feet. He stood up, stretched, and looked about him. Then he walked over to the piles of cast-off cardboard boxes. He opened the first one he came to, pulling it apart effortlessly like a bear opening a picnic basket. Inside were brand-new children's toys, still in their packaging. Turner tore open the next box. It was full of replacement coffee carafes. The third box contained plastic coat hangers. The fourth box contained outdated calendars. The fifth box contained T-shirts. Turner needed a new T-shirt, so he rummaged through that box. The only T-shirt from the box that came close to fitting someone the size of Jack Turner was a 9/11 commemorative T-shirt. It was a black-on-black design, showing nothing but the ghostly silhouettes of the Twin Towers against a black background. Turner pulled off the shirt he was wearing, flung it aside, and pulled on the new one. He returned to the grand old pine tree and its soft, shaded bed of needles. He lay back under its boughs with his fingers laced behind his head. Jack Turner was alive when 9/11 happened, but he remembered it differently than most people. His mother had still been alive. Staring up at the sky through the boughs that sheltered him, his mind drifted back to that day. Jack Turner's mother had just barely stopped herself from sinking her teeth all the way into her child's forearm. Carefully, she opened her jaws to withdraw her teeth from their bloody indenture. Turner, a pre-adolescent at the time, with hair so blonde it was almost white, stared, slightly baffled, at the teeth marks on his forearm. There were at least 30 of them, forming an arc on his punctured skin. Blood was beginning to seep from the numerous tiny wounds. Small, quick rivulets of crimson ran to the underside of his arm and dripped down onto his jeans. Turner did not say a word. His mother straightened up in her car seat, determined to keep fighting back against the impulse. It was still dark outside. She knew she had only barely won the fight that time, and had almost drunk her own son. Right after pulling into the parking spot, she had been about to turn off the engine, but the scream inside her skull changed from a dissonant disturbance on the edge of her clouded mind into an overpowering howl. The scream had crashed through her mind like an obsidian black tsunami. Overcome for a moment with that sensation only she could hear, Turner's mom had lunged across the center console of the car and bit her own child. Now, temporarily back in control of herself, she used both her hands and shirt tail to wipe blood from her lips. Quickly and carefully, she removed all traces of blood from her multiple pointed teeth before any of it could be ingested. Turner's mom noticed her hand had become rock steady while she was doing this. Both hands had been shaking terribly on the drive over to the sheriff's office. It was so bad she had had trouble controlling the car. Now, her hands were completely dead still, and she realized she was dead calm. There was one last flutter from the heart inside her chest, and then it too became like stone for all eternity. "I'm sorry," she said flatly. Her voice did not sound like his mother's anymore. Turner thought it was like how a funerary statue in a cemetery would sound if it ever deigned to speak to the living. The car radio was still on. News of planes flying into towers had been playing on repeat for days. Turner's mom reached over and turned off the car. The engine went dead and the radio went silent. All she could hear over the hellish scream in the center of her mind was the hiss of traffic going past their parked car on the state road at the other end of the parking lot. All she wanted at that moment, for all the world, was to tear into one of the living. It didn't matter who it was, as long as they had breath and their veins flowed with crimson. She deliberately looked away from her boy and at the eastern horizon. She had loved her son since the day he was born, 10 years before. Now, all of that was getting drowned out by her intense awareness of his blood cells flitting through his capillaries. She knew these were the last minutes she was going to have with him. "Mom," Turner said. His voice was still in the higher, lighter register of early boyhood. It quavered slightly as he uttered the single word. Slowly, she forced herself to look upon him. She forced herself not to notice the way his blood pulsing in his veins rippled his form in her field of vision and made the darkling light reflect off of him in lush, vulnerable tones. She forced herself not to see him as her next meal. The sun, still out of sight of the living, was causing a low, menacing rumble across her newly rendered senses. "Mom," Turner said again, this time forcing his voice to be more steady. His blue eyes had gone from wet and brimming with tears to cold and dry. "I'll protect you from them," he said to his mother. Now there was iron in his voice that had not been there just moments before. "No," she said. "I'll protect you from them." She turned away from her son and opened the driver door. She stepped out onto the pavement. She had retired as a colonel from the army years before, but still wore brightly polished combat boots anywhere she went. The colonel shined them until she could see her reflection in them. She looked down at them now as she stood with her back to her car and her son. There was no reflection. Turner heard her stiff, controlled voice speak up again in the darkness outside the car. "Remember everything I told you about the ones who hunt in the night, about their objectives, about their familiars, about their acolytes," she said to him. Then she said to her son, with her back still turned to him, "Jack, never forget who you are." Then she walked away. The boy watched his mom move across the parking lot and in through the front doors of the local sheriff's office. Colonel Turner was stopped in the lobby by a young sheriff's deputy. The building was still wrapped in the sluggish quiet of early morning. The smell of fresh coffee wafted into the lobby from deeper inside the building. "Ma'am, can I help you?" the sheriff's deputy began to say to her. "I need to report something," she said in a bright, clear voice. The deputy started to say something else, but then his vision went black for a second. He had been struck by a lightning-quick blow to his upper chest that stunned him. This was followed by another equally swift and sharp blow across the back of his shoulders, savagely knocking the wind out of him. The deputy found himself still standing somehow, but now facing completely in the opposite direction. For a second, he wondered why he couldn't breathe anymore. Time slowed way, way down. He saw an older deputy down at the end of the hallway. The other deputy was staring wide-eyed in his direction, with his mouth open. Then he shifted his weight as he dropped his coffee cup and started to run towards the lobby. The older deputy had an expression of panic on his face and was trying to draw his gun. The young deputy couldn't see the strange woman who had just walked in, but in that instant he knew she was right behind him and was somehow holding him up in place. He could not feel his legs. His hand dropped to his service revolver, and he realized his holster was empty. In that same instant, he felt the cold steel barrel of his own gun pressed up against the back of his head. The young deputy's shirt and the front of his ballistic vest were extremely tight against his chest. Whoever this lady was, she had the back of his shirt balled up in her one fist and was holding him upright with ferocious, unearthly strength, while her other hand was holding his gun pointed at his head. More deputies appeared and began to surround them. "She's got my gun," the young deputy was able to tell them in a panicked wheeze. Now a dozen deputies stood with their weapons drawn, screaming orders at Colonel Turner to drop the gun and release her captive. There were several voices yelling at her all at once. Everybody seemed hysterical, and nobody seemed in charge. This grated Colonel Turner's military sensibilities. It was certainly not how her unit would have done things. Colonel Turner could feel, more than she could hear, the menacing growl of the rising sun. It was beginning to fill the world with the first searing tips of its corona. She saw its beams begin to come in through the windows lining the top of the lobby walls. The men continued screaming disjointed and contradictory orders at her and pointing their guns and screaming some more. Colonel Turner just smiled. She remained silent and kept the gun held up against her prisoner's head. She only needed a few moments more. The first ray of light fell across the exposed skin on her wrist. The pain that caused her was volcanic, but Colonel Turner was thinking of her son, and she did not flinch. Instead, she shifted slightly so that more of her skin was in the sunlight. Jets of steam started coming off of her skin wherever it met the early morning sunlight. Then there was flame and smoke coming off of her skin, and the colonel understood that the hair on her head was beginning to catch fire. All the men in the lobby were suddenly completely silent. There was no more panicked bellowing. Every man was bewildered by what they were seeing. They forgot everything else as they stood, frozen, watching the inexplicable happen right in front of them. Colonel Turner lowered the gun and gently pushed the young deputy aside as flames and smoke sprang up all over her. She stepped all the way into the shafts of sunlight. Several minutes later, a fire truck had arrived, and its crew went to work putting out the flames that had engulfed the front of the sheriff's office building. A row of sheriff's deputies in full tactical gear emerged from behind one corner of the building. Guns drawn, moving with a careful heel-to-toe motion, they approached the colonel's parked car. They positioned themselves part of the way around it. Nobody shouted any orders this time. It was obvious the car was empty. Turner's recollections were interrupted by a fat green beetle that emerged from the bed of pine needles. It scampered up to where Turner's new T-shirt covered his belly. Not moving, Turner looked down at it bemusedly. There were no tears, no tremors, just his heart beating in its chamber a little faster than usual at the memories of his mother. He rested in the shade of the pine tree, listened to the seagulls, and let the memories from his past fall back into their hidden places. The rest of his boyhood had been spent tracking down answers to why this had to happen, and why to his mother of all people. He spent his days sifting through libraries and public records offices. Quite often, he would find a loose window latch or ventilation grate and spend whole nights in those places. Where did this evil come from? Who was involved, and how was it all connected? Through his entire adolescence and teenage years, he never stopped asking. Now almost a full-grown man, lying on his back, staring up through the branches of the old pine tree, Jack Turner focused all his attention on the tasks at hand. There were still some gaps that remained in his knowledge. Turner had known that the prince that he slew in the forest the other night was not the only one in this world. But since seeing the bats in the old chapel's belfry, Turner had come to realize they were closer in proximity and more involved than he had known. The little winged creatures had told him so in their uniquely occultic ways. Any alternate futures would have to wait for now. Soon after the sun had gone down, Turner would have to be on the move again. He needed to make his way back inside the city. He needed to fill certain gaps in his knowledge. And once that was accomplished, there was slaying to do. A vintage Cadillac had been located. Detectives Carrington and Guthridge were notified of it by the county police. It fit the description of the one Caroline Marsh had seen Dennis Peltry driving the night of her rescue in the woods. The county police reported its trunk was, oddly enough, filled with mud and dirt. The Cadillac had been left parked by a river about a mile outside of the city. Carrington and Guthridge drove over right away. When they arrived on the scene, they saw the old car. It was an elegant piece of machinery. It was something clearly from another era. It was the type of thing that would be seen at a vintage automobile show. Several police vehicles were parked near it, and the whole area taped off. Carrington and Guthridge got out of the car, walked up to the tape line, and showed their city police department badges. The scene commander held the tape up for them and let the two detectives through. She told Carrington and Guthridge there was a body in the driver's seat. Guthridge asked if there was anything to indicate the cause of death. The scene commander shrugged. "Whoever it is," she said, "he's been dead a long while." "He?" Guthridge asked. "Yeah," the scene commander replied. "I mean, he's wearing a man's suit." There was indeed a body in the car. It was hunched up over the steering wheel. The face of the cadaver had its cheekbone resting against the top of the steering wheel. The jaw hung open wide. It looked like the last thing the dead guy did in this world was to scream, and it was obvious he had been dead for a long, long time. "It looks like an Egyptian mummy dressed up in a three-piece suit," Guthridge said. Carrington asked one of the forensic officers what the time of death was. "You're kidding, right?" the officer asked. Carrington responded with a bleak chuckle. "Well, we don't know exactly until we get this person back and run some tests," the officer replied. "But off the cuff, I'd say somewhere in the middle of the last century." "Seriously?" Carrington asked. "I'm dead serious," the forensics officer said. "And I'd say that suit was on him back when he died, too, by the looks of it." "And the mud on his shoes?" Guthridge asked, pointing to the now desiccated dress shoes the corpse was wearing. When they had been new, many decades ago it seemed, they had been a very fine pair of oxblood wingtips. Now their soles were caked with fresh mud. The forensics officer leaned in for a closer look. "Yes, detective," he said, "it would appear that there's mud on the soles of their shoes." "And those muddy footprints coming from behind the car up to the driver door, too, do they match those muddy shoes?" Guthridge asked. "They do indeed," the forensics officer responded. "I can tell you, detectives, this is quite a prank someone pulled. To be honest, it really spooked some of my colleagues when they first saw that." "Look, it's highly likely that what we're seeing here is connected to another case that we have," Carrington said. "I guarantee this is going to lead somewhere a lot bigger than some kids dragging a corpse up here for a prank. Please make sure your team goes way beyond their typical rigor and care on this one." "Sure, detective," the forensics officer replied. "We certainly will." Carrington and Guthridge stepped carefully around the back of the Cadillac. The trunk was open. Someone had been using a short-handled shovel to scoop fresh, dark mud from the nearby riverbank and pile it up inside the trunk of the Cadillac. The whole thing stank of dead leaves, pollution, and decay. "This all just makes no sense at the moment," Carrington said. He rubbed his hair back on his head and let out an exasperated sigh. He turned to look at the waterway, hoping for more clues. There were none. It was night. Jack Turner kept to the least illuminated side of the building that served as the county records office. The first-floor windows were fully updated for security and even had bars over them that formed protective cages. But the budget had apparently run out by the second floor. Those were still the old windows installed probably back when Reagan was still in office. The bar of the cages over the first-floor windows curved slightly outward at the top. For someone with the height and reach of Jack Turner, this meant there was a convenient toe-hold underneath each second-story window. He stepped from window to window, reaching up and testing for vulnerabilities. The only noise he ever made was when he carefully rattled the frame of a window. Other than that, Jack Turner made no more noise than a cat. Quietly and slowly shutting the window behind him, Turner turned to face the darkness of the room. Cafe curtains meant the moonlight only came in through the top panes of the windows that ran along the entire wall of the records office. Placing his feet carefully so as not to make a sound, Turner moved across to where the records were all kept on floor-to-ceiling storage shelves. In the far corner was a small, square access panel in the ceiling that led up to the attic. There were no windows in the musty, stifling hot attic of the county records office. On previous visits, Turner had placed tar paper over the vents at either end of the eaves. Once the small, square access panel was set back firmly in its place, the attic was completely sealed off from the outside world. When Turner reached up and flicked on the single bare bulb that hung in the center of the attic ceiling, not even the town bats flying around outside could tell he was up there. Being sure only to step where there was a ceiling joist, Turner made his way to the face of the massive chimney that jutted through the attic on the building's western side. On its brickwork was an almost manic juxtaposition of old photos, post-it notes, news clippings, Xerox copies, and torn-out sections of maps. Turner had used kite string from a hardware store to indicate where he surmised connections in this webwork of persons, places, and events. In the center of this web, with several dozen kite strings radiating out from it, was a Xerox copy of an old engraving. It portrayed an 18th-century gentleman in riding boots, astride a compact and sure-footed Virginia quarter horse. The ancient engraver had strived to render the subject of the image in a way that conveyed ease and dignity. In the engraving, out beyond horse and rider, stretched fields of sugar cane. Turner stooped and retrieved a black permanent marker from the clumps of insulation at his feet. He removed the lid. With deliberate strokes, Turner blacked out the image of the rider, starting with its face. He did not stop until the rider was totally obliterated. Turner put the cap back on the pen and dropped it. "You're gone for good now," he muttered in the dim light. Turner slowly lowered his body down to the joists and insulation. Sitting cross-legged, he gazed up at the wall of chimney bricks. The tangle of elements that hung from it was as arcane as it was eclectic. Strings, news clippings, handwritten notes, antique photos, maps, and old letters copied from library Xerox machines. The latent information embedded in it would make no sense to anyone other than Turner. But the patterns that emerged from it had led Turner to his prey in the woods and to the rescue of Caroline Marsh. Now, Turner needed more. He needed to look and see what he had missed before. For there to be further emergent order from the system of patterns in front of him, Turner knew there needed to be more input. But where in the network would it go, and what type of data would trigger a revelation? Turner sat and quietly pondered. Finally, after a couple of hours, Turner got to his feet. He realized now what the bats in the belfry had been telling him. He needed to carry out more research in the records room below. It was late. Detectives Carrington and Guthridge were still working. Guthridge was at her desk. Carrington had pulled up a chair opposite her and was considering an idea that Guthridge had just posited about Marsh and Turner actually being caught up in some type of insurance fraud scheme. Her next step was to start querying the National Insurance Crime Bureau database. But Carrington couldn't get his mind off of the corpse in the Cadillac. "I got another angle," Carrington suggested to her. "It's one we should try. It might be a way to get the identity of that mummy that's sitting in the Cadillac." Okay, what's your idea? Asked Guthridge. That suit the dead guy was wearing, Carrington said. I got a good look at it. I don't think it's from the 40s. I think it's from even earlier than that. How does that help us? Guthridge asked. Well, you gotta understand how people were back then, Carrington said. You should know all about that, Guthridge chided. Very funny, Carrington said. No, I'm serious. It was an entirely different time back then. It's hard to imagine how different people were in the 1920s and even before that. You got to remember, those were still the days before cars became such a big part of everyone's everyday world. Back then, you didn't get in your car to go somewhere and do something. You got in your suit and your hat to go somewhere and do something. Guthridge said nothing and just listened. That suit the dead guy's wearing, Carrington continued, it would have been a real big deal for him. A big investment. Most people back then would have only had just one of those. Guthridge's eyes lit up. Photographs were still pretty rare too, Guthridge said. Not like today. Yep, Carrington said, nodding. If our dead guy in the Cadillac ever stood for a photograph, even once, she said, chances are he was wearing that suit for the cameraman. It's a long shot, Carrington said. It's a quick reverse image search, Guthridge said. I just got to get forensics to email me the photos. Using his hands to grip the frame of the opening, Turner let himself down from the access panel in the ceiling of the county records office. His boots touched the floorboards without making a sound. He stood still among the floor-to-ceiling bookcases. These held all the older, pre-digital city and county records. He waited in the gloom of the corner, as silent as the dust mites floating through the air. The windows on the opposite wall let in a scant bit of city light. Turner let his eyes adjust to the dimness. When he could see well enough to make out text on a page, Turner started taking binders of documents down from their places, placing them on a large wooden table in the center of the room, and paging through them. At first he started with random binders, just gaining a feel for how the information was arranged in them. Then he started to get more specific with the binders he chose. Slowly and methodically, Turner began to zero in on the data he needed. His quarry was highly secretive. Clues to their whereabouts were deliberately and elaborately hidden, woven deeply into the webwork of human affairs. But Turner had a couple of things going for him. First, the act of hiding secrets always leaves behind silhouettes and shadows in the information not hidden from view. Turner had already spent much of his youth developing a sense for the shapes these blank spaces made in whatever data he was scouring. Second, keeping secrets is also a process, a rather complex one at that. The steps of any process, no matter how obfuscated, can be analyzed and dissected. Turner knew the best way to analyze any process is to start at the end and work backwards. Every output is preceded by a set of necessary inputs, along a bifurcating and reconverging chain of events going back in time. Turner focused his search on a certain retired senator, Bo Doty. Doty had been the subject of the late Colonel Turner's last case before she died. If a person could serve as a nexus, the pin at the heart of a whirling mandala of corruption, that was what Senator Bo Doty was. 100 threads led to his spot on the wall. Doty owned a large off-grid estate nearby in the city's hinterlands. It was a place the senator visited once every week without fail. No matter where he was in the world, the senator returned promptly to his estate for a day each week, either by car or private aircraft. So, Turner began with property records of the senator's large country estate and worked backwards from there.